Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 592 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are going to be chatting with our guest, Dr. John Whyte. And listeners, if you want to continue meeting more exceptional scientists through our show, you can follow us on Twitter at PBT Science, and I'm at PhD Marie. Now today, John is going to tell us more about his life, his career, and his research. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our brilliant people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. John Whyte. So, John, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Wonderful. We are so excited to have you with us today, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So let me take a moment here, listeners, to tell you a little bit more about John. So listeners, John is the founding director and Institute Scientist Emeritus at the Moss Rehabilitation Research Institute, or MRRI. He's also the founding director of the Responsiveness Program at Drucker Brain Injury Center at MossRehab. John was awarded his MD and PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. Afterwards, he completed a residency in physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Minnesota, followed by a fellowship in traumatic brain injury at Tufts University. And among his many awards and honors, John is a fellow of the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine and recipient of their Gold Key Lifetime Achievement Award. In addition, he has received the Distinguished Academician Award from the Association of Academic Physiatrists, the Moody Prize for contributions to brain injury research and practice, and he's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. And in our interview today, John, we are looking forward to getting to know you as a scientist, as a clinician, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
I have quite a few interests. I like to cook, which I've been doing a lot more of during the COVID lockdown. I like theater, which I've been doing a lot less of during the COVID lockdown. Mm-hmm. I like getting out and walking long distances and seeing whatever I run into in the city, and music.
Phenomenal. What kind of music are you into these days?
I think my popular music taste probably got frozen many years ago, but I like many kinds of classical music as well as whatever I'm exposed to by others.
Oh, very cool. Do you play any instruments yourself?
I took lessons for a number of years on piano and oboe, but I would say the real answer to your question is no.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to get some insight into some of your passions, some of your hobbies outside of science, but you are doing some phenomenal work on the research and clinical side. So I'd love to dive into those details as well. So John, how do you describe what you do at work to people who aren't familiar with your field or your research?
Probably the first thing that I focus on is the difference between pursuing goals of human function versus more traditional disease and cure type of research, which I think many more people are familiar with. So I try to convey that the work that I do is trying to help people perform the tasks and roles that they're interested in the world, irrespective of their diseases or disabilities. And that's quite a different mindset from a traditional medical orientation.
So in terms of, I guess, the topics of your research or maybe the clinical populations that you focus on, what are we looking at?
My own research has focused primarily on patients with traumatic brain injury, although I have done some sort of broader work about research methods that focus more generally on neurologic populations broadly. But my biggest expertise is within patients who have traumatic brain injuries, and especially those with the more severe forms of traumatic brain injury.
Certainly. Well, John, I look forward to diving into some of the details of the projects that you're working on as we go through our conversation, but I'd love to talk a little bit about motivation. I think neuroscience, for me at least, is inherently motivating because it's fascinating to me. But in your case, you're kind of intersecting with this clinical population, and there's a lot of cool facets to your work. So what really motivates you or gets you excited about the work that you do?
I have kind of my whole life gravitated toward complicated and slow to be solved problems. As far back as when I worked as a summer camp counselor with children who had developmental disabilities, I was interested in working with the kids who had the most severe impairments, who weren't toilet trained, couldn't dress themselves, couldn't do anything. They weren't the most popular kids to work with, but that was what appealed to me. And when I got my early exposure to traumatic brain injury, again, it seemed to be the patients who had the slowest and rockiest journeys ahead of them that fascinated me the most. So well, I guess I'm perverse. The things which frustrate most people because they're slow and don't deliver immediate gratification, I take some pleasure in chipping away at them until I make progress, which I feel that I have. So that's good.
Phenomenal. It's great to get some insight into kind of what makes you tick there, John, but I'd love to talk about some of the people that you've been able to interact with and meet over the years, and perhaps some of the people that you've looked up to. So are there mentors or role models or just historical figures in science, perhaps, that really have had an impact on you or maybe rise up in your mind as people that you've looked up to?
Well, I had a couple of very good mentors in rehabilitation medicine during my training who really oriented me to the importance of function and the complexity of analyzing what it was that prevented someone from functioning the way they wanted to and what could be done to solve that problem. But my clinical mentors at the time didn't tend to have a great deal of science behind them because our field of rehabilitation medicine was slow to develop its scientific base. So then I also had wonderful role models as rigorous researchers. Probably the one that affected me the most and had the most supportive role was Myrna Schwartz, with whom I founded the Research Institute, but who was senior to me in terms of her research training. But truthfully, there was no way to combine the rigors of traditional neuroscience research with the needs of rehabilitation because they were so much messier and more complicated. So I didn't exactly have a mentor for the thing that I have focused on most intensively in my own work, trying to bring some rigor to this much more complicated world of human functioning.
Certainly. And you mentioned that even early on, you were interested in function and disability, working at a summer camp with children with developmental disabilities. And I'd love to maybe take it all the way back to the beginning, John, and learn a little bit more about where this interest started for you and maybe how you got from that point to now all the way here where you are today.
Well, I've been always interested in science from the time I was a young child. I liked to take gizmos apart and see what was inside them. And I asked a million questions about how things worked and so on. And for most of my growing up, I pictured myself being some kind of hard scientist working in a laboratory. I didn't think of the possibility of being a clinician. So that job that I took in during college, working with kids with developmental disabilities, I did that because it was a summer camp that was built on a behavior modification philosophy, and I was quite interested in behavioral psychology at the time. So I went there to watch the use of behavioral methods with human subjects, if you will, but I became totally fascinated with the kids and their problems, but also their personalities, their families, and the challenges that they faced and what I could do about those. And so I began seeing that my scientific skills could be brought to bear on more immediate clinical problems, perhaps. And actually, rather late in college, I switched to pre-med. I had been a science biology major, but I formally moved into a pre-med track and planned to go to medical school by the end of college.
Gotcha. And did you know kind of when you were planning all this that you wanted both the clinical and the research side of things, the MD and the PhD life?
I actually didn't. I thought toward the end of college that I was making a switch. This was also near the end of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of discussion in the culture about being relevant and doing something with your life that really mattered. And I somehow convinced myself that a guy in a white coat in a laboratory was twiddling his thumbs and not really making a difference, but somebody taking care of patients was really contributing. And so I flipped to this notion that I was going to provide services to patients in need. But very soon after starting medical school, I realized that it wasn't very compatible with my intellectual side, that an awful lot of medical school, especially at that time, was here's the list of diagnoses that you should memorize. Here's how to run through them and decide which ones are relevant in this case. And it was just so far from a scientific problem-solving perspective, not to mention that there were many things that we were taught to do just because they had always been done. So I would say within a semester of starting medical school, I found myself bored and frustrated with the curriculum and saw a flyer in my mailbox that there was an opportunity to apply for an MD PhD program. And not only could you spend time doing some interesting things, but it would pay for your medical education, which was certainly a very attractive possibility. So I did enter the program at that time and both solved my financial need problems and really it turned around my education at that point.
Then how from that point, John, did you find your way to MRRI and Moss Rehab?
Well, that was also a somewhat circuitous journey. I was pursuing a lot of my clinical training really with my research interests in mind. So as I was nearing the end of my medical school and graduate school training, I had become interested in neuroplasticity as well as learning and skill development. And those were two relevant things, obviously, in recovering from a neurologic injury, both the recovery of your brain and the ability to acquire new skills or modify your skills. So I thought, this is what I want to do. What medical specialty should I go into? And I considered both neurology and physical medicine and rehabilitation. But especially at that point in time, very few neurologists were really interested in the process of recovery. They were interested in the event that led to the damage. And then the recovery part was kind of somebody else's job. And I knew that that was exactly what I was interested in, the recovery process. So without having hardly any exposure to physical medicine and rehab as a field before then, I chose that as my medical specialty and did residency training. And even then, I anticipated that I would probably work with patients with stroke because a lot of my graduate school reading about neuroplasticity used animal models with focal lesions that were much more like stroke than any other neurologic condition. But my first opportunity clinically out of training was with traumatic brain injury, where there's not much localization to help you, or at least we didn't have the tools to know where the damage was localized. So I kind of had to really invent new and different ways of thinking about research in that population because I couldn't easily tie it to specific lesions in specific parts of the brain as I had learned.
Certainly. So then what prompted you to found MRRI? We mentioned that you were the founding director there.
Well, Moss Rehab led to that. My first job was at Tufts in Boston and working in a rehab program that was located in a skilled nursing facility. But there were administrative changes within the Tufts program after about 5 years there, and it became clear that it wasn't going to be a supportive environment for me in the long run. And so I started looking around. At that time, I knew two people who were at Moss Rehab. I knew Myrna Schwartz because, well, she was married to my first psychology professor in undergraduate school, Barry Schwartz. And so I got to know her socially, even as an undergraduate. And then she was a professor of psychology in the PhD program at Penn when I was there. So I got to know her more as a faculty member. Then I went off to residency and so on. And she, by that point, had left Penn and started to work in really the earliest points of research at Moss Rehab. She knew me. She knew I was in rehab. And she kind of suggested to the folks at Moss that I would be a good person to try to recruit. Similarly, Nat Mayer, the director of the Drucker Brain Injury Center, he knew me from rehab medicine professional circles and had been impressed with some of my early work. And so the two of them conspired to recruit me to Moss Rehab. And at that time, Moss was discussing the founding of a research institute. The board had begun to develop an interest in a larger and more ambitious research program. And so I was kind of told that if I came there and started doing my own research, if things worked out, I could very likely be the director of the institute if they moved forward with it. And of course, that's what happened. I started my own research program, but then within a couple of years, the board did agree that they wanted a research institute, and they invited me and Myrna Schwartz to found that research institute in 1992.
Excellent. Well, listeners, networking is key, I think, is one of the morals of the story.
Indeed.
Well, John, I know you've got so much going on right now in terms of research as well as the clinical side of things that you're working on. What is maybe the project that you are the most excited about at the moment that you want to tell us about?
Well, at the moment, the thing that I'm working most actively on is actually a much more general rehabilitation topic. It's a little abstract, but I'll do my best at explaining it. And that is that With the exception of drugs and surgical procedures, which occupy a small role in rehabilitation, most of the treatment that we provide in rehabilitation involves interaction between a patient and a therapist, a physical therapist, occupational therapist, speech therapist, or whatever, around certain kinds of behavioral goals and changes. And we have no nomenclature for describing those treatments in any standard fashion, and consequently, no way to easily study their effectiveness. So if you think about when you do a drug study, you're comparing a drug chemical name that means a particular ingredient, and you're comparing that either to a different ingredient or to a placebo, an inactive ingredient. But you know, or at least you've hypothesized what the active ingredient is, and that's what you're testing. But in rehabilitation, we talk about treatments as an hour of physical therapy, or a course of cognitive remediation treatment, or gait training. All of these are labels either for the discipline of the person providing the treatment or for the problem that we're treating. But imagine if I said, I'm taking heart attack medication. Is that effective?
Right.
You'd need to know what that medication was in order to answer the question. But that's the way we live in rehabilitation. I'm having cognitive rehabilitation. Oh, good. That's effective.
Right.
So this has been a huge problem in the development of evidence about effectiveness in rehabilitation, because we don't know if we compare gait training to something else, whether we're always comparing the same thing. We don't know whether two people doing gait training are doing the same thing. And much rehabilitation research that has attempted to look at the efficacy of things defined at the level of hours of physical therapy has failed to find efficacy. And we believe that's partly because some of what's buried in that label is effective, some of it's ineffective. It's just not a viable way to ask the question. So we and colleagues started trying to attack this problem more than 10 years ago in some committee work through the American Congress of Rehab Medicine, and then a couple of different federal agencies recognized the importance of the problem and provided some funding to work on it. And we participated in two different grant programs, one 5-year and one 3, that were intended to create a standardized system and set of rules by which any rehabilitation treatment could be described and what we call specified. And we now have developed such a system. It's been created in a manual, a set of rules and procedures. The manual is publicly available, and we're developing various kinds of curriculum materials to help people learn about the system. It's also beginning to have some impact. So, for example, an upcoming published guideline recommending how people should describe their research in rehabilitation research publications is going to use the skeleton of our system to guide description of research. So we hope that if this system is broadly adopted and people are trained in it, that it will then allow studies of new treatments to be described in this way. It will allow meta-analyses to aggregate treatments that make sense to aggregate and not ones that don't. And it will allow clinicians to supervise and give feedback to each other about whether they are or aren't delivering the active ingredients that are inherent in a given treatment.
Certainly. Well, John, this is a phenomenal project. And I think in describing this project, you've really brought to light one of the major challenges in rehabilitation research. And I know as a scientist, you encounter a lot of challenges, regardless of what field you're in. So there are these days, I think I've had them, many of our listeners I'm sure have as well, where it seems like everything's going wrong and things are just falling apart. So have you had one of these experiences or just a major failure that you can tell us about and maybe walk us through how you got through it?
Well, I don't know if I have a single catastrophic failure. I certainly have a lot of examples of things where I have not made the kind of progress that I had hoped for and where I've had to change courses in some way. I think that I'm characterologically kind of a ridiculous optimist, so that helps. But what I've tended to do in many cases is rightly or wrongly think of those failures not as personal failures, but as illustrations of some kind of methodologic challenge. And then I say to myself, well, what can I learn from that? And maybe even what can I publish about that, because I'm not the only person to have faced that problem. And sometimes these are very scientific methodologic issues that I discover and write about. Some of my work on assessment in very severe brain injury comes out of the fact that I couldn't measure things well, and that was frustrating. And so then I had to develop measurement approaches. But aside from those individual scientific developments, the other thing is that some of my failures have helped me understand what patients care about. And I think nowadays, where there's much more focus on patient-reported outcomes and patient engagement, there's more overt awareness. But I, for example, was looking to develop day programs for cognitive problems that would allow me to study those cognitive problems. So it would be good for me because these people would be in a day program where I could collect data, and good for them because they would have something to occupy themselves. But what I discovered is, despite everyone's complaints about individuals with traumatic brain injury having nothing to do during the day if they were too impaired to work, relatively few of them wanted to travel to my clinic every day as their solution. So we have to really ask people whose lives are affected in certain ways, what kinds of solutions will be acceptable to them before we set about developing ones that make sense to us.
Definitely. And I think a lot of the world has shifted to virtual in the past year. Do you think this is going to have a big impact on how you approach these problems, or maybe the kinds of solutions you can offer patients?
I think so, yes. I mean, obviously some things that involve physical intervention can't be done virtually, but we know that some of the most enduring negative effects of severe traumatic brain injury are psychosocial and mental health areas. And we also know that even individuals who are quite distressed with anxiety or depression or other kinds of psychiatric symptoms often still have trouble getting themselves to a clinic on a regular basis. And when you add potential economic limitations, and they may not be able to drive and so on and so forth, it just becomes that much more complicated. So I think that the ability to deliver especially psychosocial kinds of services remotely will be really important and has been pushed by the current pandemic. But even after the pandemic is over, especially for people living in rural areas, it will be an incredible service if we can deliver good care remotely.
Oh, absolutely. That would be a huge success. And I know in science, in medicine, successes can be few and far between sometimes. You often face these frustrating challenges, but I'd love to talk about these moments of victory that you've had. So, John, do you have a favorite success, whether it was a big win or just a small one that was particularly meaningful that you can tell us about?
Well, maybe I'll give you a combination of a big one and also a bunch of little ones in the same area. And that's my work with patients with disorders of consciousness. So my very first job out of training was in a kind of facility that doesn't even exist anymore, one of these nursing home-based rehab programs that was providing fairly intensive rehab therapy to unconscious or minimally conscious patients. This was in the era of fee-for-service medicine, so it was also a bad business model. For-profit nursing homes were able to bill for therapy day after day, whether or not a patient was getting better. So not a good model ultimately, but a tremendous training opportunity for me because I cared for 80 patients with disorders of consciousness under one roof.
Oh, wow.
I've never cared for more than about 6 at a time since then. So I've developed a tremendous amount of experience, but one of the frustrations was the amount of argument among clinicians and between clinicians and family members about whether someone's state of consciousness was, whether they were conscious at all, and whether that state of consciousness was changing. Because consciousness can't be observed directly, so it has to be inferred from I did something and the patient did something in return, and then I conclude that that was an instance of conscious behavior. So lots of opportunities for coincidental responses that don't really mean anything and for reading into things emotionally because you're hoping for a response. So I used that early frustration as the motivation to develop a measurement system for definitively determining someone's state of consciousness and for determining whether it was changing over time or just fluctuating randomly from day to day. And then using that kind of measurement tool, we were able to show that some patients continue to make progress over much longer intervals of time than we had ever thought. I was also frustrated by the fact that people were using every possible psychoactive medication in an off-label manner and trying to figure out what worked, and none of us could figure out what worked. And again, ultimately took that frustration to a randomized controlled trial with my colleague, Joe Giacino, where we demonstrated that a drug that was readily available, had been on the market for years, did accelerate the return of consciousness. And that was the first randomized controlled trial of any drug to show that you could influence the course of neurologic recovery. So that was a big deal. That's the one that was my single big accomplishment, because up until that time, there had not been a single drug that had convincing efficacy in this situation. So that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It got a lot of attention, and it really has become the standard of care for treatment of patients with severe disorders of consciousness. But although I'm proud of that, and of course, it's the thing that I got the most attention for because of the New England Journal of Medicine, what I really feel the most wonderful about is that just in 2019, a new evidence-based guideline about the care for patients with disorders of consciousness was published. It's a consensus piece by the American Academy of Neurology, the American Congress of Rehab Medicine, and the TBI model system. And it, for the first time, really says there's strong evidence that these patients can benefit from rehabilitation, that they have a decent prognosis, that there are treatments that can make a difference. And a fairly large amount of the research that contributed to that evidence-based guideline is research that I've been working on throughout my whole career.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations, John, to you and, of course, your colleagues on this exciting series of successes within this research area. I think that's wonderful. And I think the success is almost addicting. It makes you want to keep going back into the lab, keep doing research and keep doing more. And I think it's easy for scientists to sort of get overwhelmed and be constantly immersed in the literature. But we like to encourage our listeners to step back, take a break, do a little bit of reading for fun if they can. So I love giving everybody on our show books and book recommendations. So, John, is there a particular book that you've really enjoyed that you want to recommend for me and our listeners, whether it's related to science or not?
One book that comes to mind that's sort of related to science and sort of not is actually the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. It covers his life only up until, I think, shortly after the revolution. So it's relatively early part of his life. But I found it so entertaining because he was, of course, incredibly smart, incredibly perceptive, and not egotistical, but totally aware of his own brilliance. It didn't come off as annoying, but he would just say, well, I figured this out and we need to do this because I figured it out. And he figured out so many things. So I think the book appealed to me because he was a problem solver, and just walking down the street, any problem he saw, he would say, I wonder if I could solve that problem. And then also he clearly took a great deal of joy from life. So they weren't problems that were dragging him down. They were problems that were intriguing him or stimulating him.
Oh, that's wonderful. It sounds like a good outlook to have on life to motivate us to keep going, particularly, I think, during this pandemic time where a lot of people are just kind of struggling to find the motivation and the optimism. Well, excellent recommendation. We will add it to our reading list for our listeners to find there. And I know in terms of effects of the pandemic, I think one of the huge impacts for scientists has been travel, or perhaps lack thereof these days. But we love talking about travel on our show because I think in normal times, this is a big perk of the life of a scientist. You get to go to a lot of different places to work with people all over the world and to share your research. So, John, when you think back, is there a particular place that you've been to for science that was just your absolute favorite?
I think there is, and it's not a place that I would have predicted. It's Copenhagen, not a terribly exotic place to an American, but I was invited to be a visiting professor there, and it was in a sustained way over a number of years, so that I visited Copenhagen a couple times a year for almost 10 years, lecturing, interacting with students that I got to know over multiple years, and interacting with colleagues there, some of whom I've done a number of research studies with. So I guess I agree that travel is one of the big motivations for me. And it's sort of ironic that I decided not to retire completely, but to continue to work part-time, in part so that I could continue with my international travel, none of which I've been able to do since. So, but it's not only the travel, but even my work at home. I can't overstate how much of the pleasure comes from the people. I don't want to be in a laboratory by myself with test tubes and computers. I want to be talking and arguing and thinking with others and creating with others. So for me, science is a very social activity, and rehabilitation science, because rehabilitation tends to be a team process clinically, is even more of a collaborative and interactive thing. And then travel just caps that off, because I see people whose scientific views differ from mine, but also people whose cultural experiences and practices differ. So it's really one of the big motivators for me.
Certainly. And you mentioned you've been able to spend quite a bit of time in Copenhagen, and it sounds like you really got to know the area then. Once the pandemic lifts and our listeners are able to go out and really travel again, what are some of the things they must see if they go to Copenhagen?
Well, there are, of course, the traditional tourist sites like the Tivoli Amusement Park and the Hans Christian Andersen statue of the woman in the water. But I guess the thing that has appealed to me the most, which wouldn't be as quickly evident to a tourist, is getting to know the people and the culture. So it's going out to restaurants and seeing how people live there. And well, Denmark, to me personally, is a very attractive country right now because it has low levels of income inequality and a lot more social safety net. So to me, it's a culture that works much better than the United States, particularly in terms of healthcare, where things are not as fragmented. So that's been a nice opportunity for me to see how I could do research in a different and more coherent healthcare system.
Certainly. Well, it sounds like it's had a big impact on you. And I think going to these different places, being able to meet and work with and get to know these colleagues are some of the phenomenal things about working as a scientist. And you mentioned specifically a lot of what you enjoy in your job. And perhaps part of the reason you haven't left it at this point is the people you've been able to work with. And I know in the media, scientists are often portrayed a particular way as being very serious, very critical, kind of that lone scientist working in the lab. And I think, as you mentioned, that is not the case almost all of the time. So I think the scientists I've met are these creative, funny, amazing, multifaceted people. And you developed fun traditions and just quirky memories and things that happen over the years that go against this stereotype. So John, do you have an example from your own experience of one of these kind of human moments in science?
I think probably most labs have some kind of wacky little tradition. You may have had other people on this program from Moss refer to the same quirky tradition, but we have an annual holiday party where people bring a gift, sort of a gag gift, a White Knight game it's called. And we have usually one or two things that come back year after year because they're so terrible. And whoever got them last year will try to unload them on a new person. So it's always quite exciting to see who will get stuck with the circle of dolphins dancing around a fountain, for example. Everyone wants that.
That sounds amazing. What are some of the other gifts, or maybe what's the most memorable gift that you've contributed?
I contributed a Barbie change purse that I found on the floor of an airport.
Oh, wow.
And it was highly sought after.
Does it come back year after year, or was that one taken off the market?
No, that one was scooped right up and kept. It's the ones that are bad that come back year after year. But like the Santa toilet cover seat, that was seen once only, and that's in someone's proud possession forever now.
Oh, that is wonderful. I'm glad to hear that it sounds like you and your colleagues are able to have fun with this gift exchange every year. And I think you're absolutely right. Bringing that sense of humor and getting everyone together outside of the specific research environment is a great way to kind of build that community and build that camaraderie.
Indeed.
And I think that's so important because you are tackling some tough questions, and we've touched on some of them during our conversation today. But I know, John, so many scientists are sort of stifled a little bit in the work that they can do by limitations in funding, staff, technology, feasibility, and just other barriers you encounter as a researcher. So if we took those away, John, do you have a particular problem or a question, something that maybe keeps you up at night that you would want to tackle first?
Probably reflecting my sort of meta problem solving orientation. There's not a particular scientific question that I would prioritize. There's really more of an infrastructure issue that keeps us from making progress altogether. So I would like to find ways to create data networks from rehabilitation clinical institutions, sort of analogous to cancer trial networks, where even if you go to a private practice oncologist, you are likely to be offered enrollment in a clinical trial because that oncologist is connected to a whole bunch of different possible trials for different conditions. And yet the vast majority of patients who enter rehabilitation enterprise for service don't contribute any data that is meaningful or useful for us learning. So it's a combination of hooking together those institutions as sources of data, but then related to the treatment definition issue that I raised before, we have to get to the point where what's in those clinical data sources is useful for analysis, which it isn't yet. But if we could solve that infrastructure problem, I just don't think that we can do a randomized controlled trial on every important question. And yet we have very little ability to learn from practice the way things are currently organized.
Oh, very interesting. Well, I appreciate you sharing these insights and some of these big questions and infrastructure problems that you are thinking about. And we've talked about a lot of different topics, John, but I'd love to end our conversation today with advice. So when you think back about your career, is there one particular piece of advice that somebody gave you at some point that had a big impact and really helped you that you can pay forward to our listeners today?
I think the best sort of guidance, I'm not sure if I can relate it to a particular moment of advice, but the best guidance that I got was to try to think about your long-term interests in a broad way and then look for opportunities to fund pieces of that, as opposed to thinking of a series of specific projects that will be funded by this and that may or may not add up to anything. So it's a tough job because you do need funding, but it's important to have a vision of where you want your research to go, irrespective of funding, and then begin to think about, well, this piece would appeal to this funding agency, that piece would appeal to that funding agency. This piece I got to move forward on institutional funds until I can convince people it's as fascinating as I think it is, and so on and so forth.
I think that is excellent advice because I think you're absolutely right. It's so easy to get caught up in the moment and kind of that immediate next step that you need a project funded. But I think keeping that big picture in mind is critical to keeping your career as a whole moving forward. So thank you for sharing that with our listeners. Is there any other last piece of advice, John, you want to leave everybody with, or maybe a last note of inspiration you'd like to end on?
Well, I feel fortunate that I have been happy to go to work almost every day. And I think that's partly because the work is interesting. It's partly because the institution that I've been privileged to work in has been a really good and supportive institution. But I do think it's important to like your work. There are plenty of frustrations in science, so that if you're not really enjoying what you're doing, it's not going to play out well. But if you like the people, the environment, the work that you do day in and day out, then I think you can survive the ups and downs of external success.
Well, excellent note to end on, John. If our listeners want to learn more and they're curious about the things we talked about today, what is the best way for them to get in touch or learn more?
Probably a good place to learn about what I'm doing and what others in our group are doing is to visit the website, which is www.MRRI.org. So there are profiles of me and other scientists and some of the things we've developed, as well as contact information there.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely check out the website. Get in touch if you have any questions. And John, it was such a pleasure to chat with you on the show today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for being here. Listeners, thank you for joining us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.